Inside Your Mind, the BCPA Podcast.
Welcome to the second episode of Inside Your Mind, the BC Psychological Association podcast series. And we have the pleasure of having a guest with us, Dr. Erika Horwitz, going to speak to us today about a chat with me about trauma. And I will be hosting the session. I am Wolfgang Linden, now retired, former professor in clinical psychology at UBC. And I've done a lot of volunteer work, continue to do it with the college and other groups, which is how you kind of end up getting to play the role of host for this particular event. Dr. Horwitz is educated locally and has been the director of the Counseling Center at SFU for many years, is now in private practice, and has very much specialized on the topic of trauma and how to deal with trauma. And I really look forward to chatting with her. And is also currently president of the association. And as such, I will take the opportunity to thank you for all the volunteer work, because having done it myself, I know that most members of organizations are on standby. They want to know, what do you do for me? So all the people that actually do something on their own that takes time and effort, unpaid effort, I really appreciate it. I thank you for that. So there are tons of things one could talk about. And maybe we'll just start with, what do we consider events that are likely traumatic? And has it changed over time with which events count, or how we conceptualize trauma?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Wolfgang, for sharing this time with me. It's always a pleasure. I will start by saying that trauma is an experience that is significant enough that it shatters life as you knew it prior to it. And of course, there's degrees of trauma. There's, one of the famous traumas we hear about is people who go to war, for example, right? So it's commonly known that many people who go to war and are fighting in a war come back with what's considered post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But there is a range and continuum from PTSD to various levels of trauma. And one thing that I think is important to say is that for people, an experience can be traumatizing to different degrees based on individual differences. Some people have more sensitive souls, and that may lead to a smaller traumatic experience, creating a lot more distress. And some people that are not as sensitive or more resilient, whatever you want to call it, they may have a strong traumatic experience that does not affect them as much. I think it's important to not box everybody in the same place, that it really does vary based on individual differences. And the types of trauma, as I said, it can be war, it can be somebody is robbed or, broke into your house or things like that. But even, for example, somebody who consider themselves healthy, say for 40 years, and suddenly they get a diagnosis of diabetes, for example, right? That can be traumatic. It can change life as they knew it. And then they become afraid of illness. I have a daughter that was a healthy person in her 20s, and one day she couldn't feel her legs. She couldn't feel her legs. She couldn't feel her legs, and took a few visits to emergency and so on. And finally, she was diagnosed with MS. Right, so that experience changes her identity, changes life as she knew it. And then a few months later, she ended up also being diagnosed with Lyme disease, which is a horrible problem and illness. And so she became afraid of illness, right? It just makes sense. So one thing that I think is common to all traumatic experiences is that they lead to some level of anxiety or fear, because now the brain knows bad things can happen. I gotta watch. I gotta be afraid.
So depending on what the event is, of course, it's either bloody obvious, if you been exposed to very traumatic things. Like one that, comes to mind. I've done some assessments with RCMP officers who were on the accident investigation team. So they go in after the fact when there's been a lot of trauma. And they actually are required to do annual briefings that the RCMP pays for, which is a very good thing that they do this. So they told me a few stories about what they saw, and I will not repeat them. They were totally gory. So nobody doubts that this is a likely traumatic event. But as you scale it down, at what point, I don't want to say does it become exaggerated or meaningless, but if a supervisor yells at you, is that traumatic? The main events, and like I said, gory accidents or rape, victim murder, we know that it's a horrible event.
That's a really good question because, as I said, the way the person reads the experience, right, or is what may lead to feeling traumatized. So you say if your boss yells at you, well, let's say that person had a father who yelled at them their whole childhood and they were afraid of this father, right? Now, the brain has recorded male yelling is dangerous. And so then your boss yells. So I think it's complex. You can't quite just define it black and white, black and white. I know that today a lot of people are talking about, I'm so traumatized. I'm so traumatized. You know what I mean? It's good and bad because now people are talking more about mental health. And I think that's a good thing. But some people may not be as educated to understand it. For me, it's if the event led you to not now feel unsafe when you are exposed to something like it or the actual trigger, that indicates to me that something's happened to this person. And what we know now about trauma is that it's not a psychological issue per se, is that the brain and the nervous system are involved, right? So if, for example, the example I give my patients is, back in the jungle era of humanity, there's a tiger that attacks your friend. The brain is automatically recording before the tiger, during the tiger, after the tiger, smell of the tiger, look at the tiger, because it needs to be ready for the future, right? And so then the slightest thing in the future that could be tiger, like a sound or a smell, the nervous system goes into the fight or flight response, right? You just need to either be ready to fight that tiger or run as fast as you can. So to me, when I work with people or talk to people, that's what I explore. Did the event lead the person to now not feel safe? Is their nervous system now in alert when something could potentially appear like the trigger that relates to the trauma? So I think that that's what would indicate whether something was traumatic or not, because some people I've had patients that have had car accidents, right? And some are not as traumatized as others are, right? It's there's the individual differences piece there as well.
Now, a tricky issue, the way I've heard about it, I really haven't had to deal with it myself, is when things like pensions are involved. So, for example, somebody wants to get a disability pension, and that was a traumatic event. Then it must get very tricky to do an assessment where you could properly tease out what is really the kind of traumatic event that is very likely to produce a traumatic response and maybe full-on PTSD versus what is a person who has a relatively minor provocation, but also has a very low level of resilience, doesn't have a lot of resources to deal with it. Are they both equally justifying asking for a disability pension?
Yeah, boy, you get into a tricky area, right? Because unless you do assessments with measures, right, that are evidence-based measures and questionnaires, and that may help give some answer. But if you do it through dialogue, interview, discussion, it's very hard to know how accurate or how honest the person's being in describing the degree of distress that they feel. I'm hoping that as time goes by, that we'll have technology that can measure the nervous system and so on and so forth. But It's one of the challenges for psychologists, right? Is ethically assessing to the best of your ability if you need to communicate with an insurance company that's requested this assessment on whether this person is truly unable to continue work and they are deserving of that disability. But I think in our field, there's a certain level of degrees and subjectivity, unless you're using measures, which in psychology we have, but not all psychologists use those to be able to assess truly the degree to which this person is traumatized.
Yeah. I've heard stories. Maybe we cannot even keep this one in the interview ultimately, but where recently the RCMP has allowed pensions to go increase by $500 a month if there is evidence of PTSD in their history, an exposure to traumatic events as part of their job. And what I've heard is that some of them come back to their psychologists who may have seen them for very different issues and are now pushing the psychologist to declare that they have PTSD so they can get their extra pension.
Yeah, that's it's a sad reality of human nature, right? I mean, you see it in court cases too, right? You have two experts, one for the defense, one for the prosecution, assessing the same person, and they can have completely conflicting reports, right? So it is a challenge in that way, right? But for those of us that are serving people in therapy, for the most part, people don't have an investment in exaggerating, unless there's a personality disorder, which is a whole other topic. But often they don't even know they have trauma. Like I've had them in my office, they're describing how they feel. And I'm the one that gives them this explanation of the continuum of trauma and how that presents and why they seem to be reactive in situations that they weren't previously reactive, or they constantly feel in a state of hypervigilance. So there's many things that indicate that people have trauma. The other piece with that as well is, that combination that I talked about earlier of what your temperament or your own predisposition to mental illness brings to that. So for example, if you were to have 3 bowls with marbles representing predisposition, right? So in the first bowl, you may have 2 marbles. In other words, there's not a lot of predisposition, say for anxiety. But if you have a very strong traumatic experience, right, you'll develop that. And the person that has a lot of marbles, right, the trauma may not take a lot, right? I grew up with a brother who was not diagnosed with bipolar disorder till he was in his 40s. I mean, he's in his 60s now. So at the time I grew up in Mexico, they weren't diagnosing that. I don't know, but and he had some serious traumas. Growing up, the divorce of my parents, my dad used to beat him up with a belt, whatever. But for him, the mental illness, because he had a predisposition for bipolar disorder, really exploded his traumatic responses and, his need to control and so many other things because of that predisposition. So, in the end, Wolfgang, it's those of us that work in the field, you just realize how complex we are, right? Then you have people that have had really tough childhoods and they're just so resilient, right? But they had fewer marbles in their bowl that predispose them for so much trauma reactivity.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'd like to, dig in a bit more into this because you were invited to participate in this podcast because you've written a book about it. And it makes a lot more sense to have a presenter with a topic for whom it has special personal meaning because it's very different than just an academic, throwing some slides at you in a normal psychology class. So what made you decide to write a book, and what did you learn from it? How did it change your look on the topic?
Absolutely. I love psychology. I took my first class at Douglas College out of interest. I had come from Mexico to live in Canada. I married a fellow from Canada, and I was young and bored. And he said, "Oh, just go to college, take the class." Fell in love with psychology, and that was, 1983. So I date myself here. And I'm just fascinated by human experience and human behavior. So on the side, I have this brother who's 3 years older than me, who as a teenager, we didn't know what was wrong. He would stay up all night creating. And then he would sleep during the day, and very reactive at times. He would go in his bedroom and destroy his room, right? Like just a lot of reactivity. My dad just thought he was spoiled, or he didn't stick with things, or so, his self-esteem got ruined in the way. He got married, had kids, had a lot of troubles. He would have jobs and he would lose the jobs. He's very brilliant, intelligence-wise, didn't have it in him to go to university, etc. And so as the years went by, his personality being around him was just so unbearable. Like if we would go to gatherings, none of the cousins wanted to sit next to him because he was so.
So that experience precedes knowing anything about it from a professional psychology perspective, right? Just personal.
Yeah. And so eventually about.
And of course, you don't know what to do with
15, 12 years ago, he moved to a city where my oldest daughter moved to that city in Mexico because she got married and was living there. So I was visiting often, started spending time with him, and he didn't take medication. He's one of those people that tried medication. He felt it numbed him. And so he didn't like it. And I was in his presence and I thought, holy moly, what a transformation, because it was not talking the talk. I could see almost the Buddha in him, right? So I said, his name is Saul, but we pronounce it Saul in Spanish. I said, Saul, you have to write this book. This book has to be written. This is an important story because it is so unusual. And so we started the process. Like he would write and then I would, take it and write and send it back. And of course, I'm a witness to the story, right? Because I've known it since I was born, and saw how it all got bad and saw how it all got better.
Does it make it easier to write it when you've been a witness, or does it make it harder?
Well, I'm so inspired by his experience that every time I was working on the book, I would turn to my husband and say, "Oh my God, this is so amazing. I don't know if it's because my brother." So he did find it hard. He had to revisit, because the way that I wanted him to talk in the book was his inner experience. What is it like inside to have that mind? So he describes how unwell he was. He confesses how his behaviors, how he wasn't good to people. Like he's very humble. And then in the second half, he goes, one by one, his lessons, but he called them miracles. Even though he talks in the book that he was an atheist, now he's agnostic. And so I looked up the definition of miracle. And of course you have the religious meaning, but the other meaning is something unexpected that is improbable and extraordinary. And yet it happens. That's why the book is called Improbable and Extraordinary, because it's so improbable and it's so extraordinary. He did that. So to me, it was really giving voice to his story, but bringing it to people to be inspired. Even if you don't have a problem with mental illness, I mean, it's very likely you know somebody that has a problem with mental illness if you don't have it. But just those people that with hard work and dedication, they transform. And in his case with trauma, we had a divorce. My dad used to hit him pretty badly to the point of breaking the belt. My mom left us for a couple of years because she couldn't handle the divorce. And we were left with my dad, who was quite alcoholic. It was a lot of trauma. And that really combined with his predisposition to really create the perfect storm for someone, right?
What can we learn from it in a larger sense? What are the implications of knowing this for designing treatment plans for individuals or care systems?
Well, I think the main thing for me is that change is possible. If my brother, who was so unwell and has, in a way, a brain disorder, like, bipolar disorder, could transform to that degree, then it's just about hope. And that's what we both feel about telling the story, is it just gives hope, right? That he had to work very hard, and he tells the story. A lot of it was on doing his own trauma, right? Like for him, he believes in catharsis, right? And in really reaching the pain that the trauma caused you and being able to release it and create a different meaning. Because he used to blame my dad. My dad is his fault. I'm this way. Da, 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 da. And then when he did this work, he released that. He took responsibility for his own well-being and stopped focusing on whoever was to blame. And just that processing, I interact with him all the time.
Did he do it completely on his own, or did he have professional help?
No, he couldn't afford.
With addicts, oftentimes it's being said that they don't really change until they walk bottom and start to see that if I do it one more time, I'll die. And that is enough of a trigger to actually stop. But it has to go on for a long, long time and we hurt before they activate.
Wolfgang, you hit it on the nail, because he had a lot of suicidal crises, as he calls them. And one particular day, he was, I don't know how old, in his 40s. He had 2 grown kids in their early 20s probably. And he decided he was going to take his life. And he sat in his car. His plan was to drive his car to a highway and crash into a semi-truck, because he didn't want my mom to know he killed himself. So he was going to do it so it looked like an accident. So he sat in the car, ready to do it. He started the car. He was driving. And in that moment, he remembered. And that's where you wonder about, the universe supporting you, because he's driving, convinced he's going to do it. And then he remembered that a friend about a year before told him about this group where they help people like him. It's an AA group. They use the same framework, but the people running it had added different things to it. And they helped anybody, even if you didn't have an addiction. My brother had an addiction earlier in his life, but he said he's an addict because he'll be addicted to buying books, or he'll be addicted to different things, not to a substance anymore. So instead of killing himself, he drove to this group and sat next to this fellow who had invited him. And that was his bottom, because that bipolar sort of has grandiosity in it. So for him, everybody's idiots up till then. And that day, he just surrendered to somebody guiding him. He got lucky because the fellow who was guiding him was not a psychologist, but a lot of what he did with him really connects with psychological principles and my brother just obeyed, quote unquote, what he was told. And through a lot of standing in the podium and telling his story and having catharsis and having the support and guidance of this. In Mexico, they call them godfathers. Here, they call them sponsors in those kinds of groups. And he just surrendered to the process, and it took a while. But I've been interacting with him for years, writing this book. I'll give you an example. The book has won about 7 or 8 awards for mental health, for memoir, for addiction, and so on. And so I would say, Saul, aren't you excited? He would say, yes, but I need to watch my ego. I'm not going to go back into grandiosity, right? So yes, but I have to be careful, right? Like he has so many dreams of being famous and now he's really, so you just see in the way he lives his life, how he's really transformed. And so he healed a lot of the traumas, and he's no longer hijacked by triggers. So to me, I say this is an example of hope. We can all heal trauma. We can all feel better. We can, even if you have a mental illness, with dedication, with the right supports, sometimes with the right medications. In case he didn't take medication, people can feel better.
So when you look at that experience and you look at the reality of Vancouver is a painful place for this one, of people with traumatic experiences leading them to addictions, to homelessness. What are the take-home messages on what we can do better or different?
Oh, I was driving here, and many of us that work in this field were very just naturally quite empathic. And every time I drive by and see the folks on the street, I feel literally like crying. It's just so painful to see all those people with children, with all the potential, with all the futures, and again, there's the predisposition for addiction and then trauma that combine into leading to that.
This is not, an empty story. I see the same things. It stings and hurts just the same way. And no big surprise here in our profession. I know a lot of people who work in the area, and I know their frustrations. And they would all love to know, what should I do to break through?
Yeah. The thing with addiction, though, which is often connected to trauma, is, that there's a model by Clement, I'm sure you know it, right, of readiness for change in addiction. And sometimes people are so connected to their addiction or so needy of it that they don't even contemplate wanting to change. And so if we intervene when they're not in that place of readiness, it is very hard for people to stop an addiction. I mean, it is addictions are not only the substance that of course numbs the pain, is also so habitual, so ritualistic. So it's a complex thing to transform. I just wish, I think Canada being such a wealthy country, right, that they would create settings for these folks not to live on the streets, and perhaps in safer settings with the right supports, they might, be able to transform their lives.
Yeah, I mean, we have the housing studies that were done, and actually it's what home study, you're probably familiar with it. I mean, they're pushing very clearly the point that, housing with supports is critical. But there's so many voices out there who send out conflicting messages, driving politicians crazy with expectations that can't work. It's like I have one very good friend who's a psychiatrist, and I think he strikes a really good balance in understanding the biology and the sociocultural factors that keep things going. And I mean, of course, he's just as frustrated as we are. You can imagine. But you need to get people going in the system. So if, for starters, you don't even have a family physician, and you can't get into the system. So
yeah. Oh, well, that is a big, complex thing. Access to mental health services is also a challenge. But, I also feel that there's things people can do to help themselves along the way, right? Like, I mean, what we know with trauma today as well is that, as I said earlier, it's a nervous system that's involved, right? We go into fight or flight. And so we have so many ways to help people regulate their nervous system today. I mean, when I started studying, they talked about trauma, you really didn't hear the nervous. I mean, you would hear the fight or flight and it's like 100, but now that's the conversation. The vagus nerve, the nervous system, how the brain is so involved in trauma. And so people, even just the simple practice of the relaxation exercise, right? You just relax, deep breaths, relax your feet, relax your legs, relax your arms, and so on and so forth. Somebody that doesn't have access to services, or you can find that on YouTube, or there's free apps and so on, right? Like, you just practice that every day and start helping your nervous system to regulate, right? My brother does a lot of meditation and a lot of staying present. And the other thing is cognition when it comes to trauma, right? So you have the response, but the mind is also involved, right? Like, oh, I'm not worthy. I'm unsafe. All people from that school are unsafe. Or the mind concludes things about the trauma and then lives by them. So teaching people to first identify what is that, right? Like, I tell a story of when I was a kid and my parents got divorced, and my dad forced my mom to divorce. This is Mexico, it's a long story. But anyways, he kidnapped us. Believe it or not, he took out my brothers and I. He said to my mama that you signed those papers so you won't see them again. So, and we were taken from her for about 3 months, and we were returned. And she was really depressed. And her psychiatrist, that was her counselor at the time, said to her, you need to go. I guess he figured if my mom was in my dad's vicinity, she was not going to get better. So she talked to my dad. My dad said, okay, go visit your aunt in New York and I'll take the kids. And so, but she didn't say goodbye because she thought it would be too upsetting to say goodbye. So she just left, and my dad took us, and I didn't see her for 2 years. I saw her crying and crying and crying and crying when my dad left her. So my little self, that was the trauma, right? Too much abandonment and separation. My little self, without knowing, concluded abandonment is awful. I will never do it. But it was in my unconscious. Fast forward, I get married to my Canadian husband, have 2 kids, whatever. And the marriage was problematic. He had an alcoholism problem. People would ask me, well, why don't you leave? And I'd say, oh, because I love him. I'm in therapy. We're going to figure it out. And about 10 years into the marriage, a friend asked me, but Erika, why are you still there? And it's like my brain just answered, because I can't abandon him. And then I was going to therapist and work through that of, my little self decided never to abandon. And I was in a marriage that wasn't right for me. So then, of course, with a therapist, I worked through my rights to be well, to have a healthy life and not stay with someone just because I don't want to abandon them, right? So that to me is an example of how trauma manifests in our lives, in choices that we make and what we're afraid of, and why we work so hard sometimes because I don't feel worthy. So I'm going to show the world that I am worthy. So there's so much people can do to heal that, right? Just with the awareness and transforming that.
I wonder, what we can do to even prevent it. Because I've quite an interest in adverse childhood events and written a paper with a colleague on looking at exact timing issues. And so I'm pushing the notion where I can that we need to reduce childhood adversity before the age of 2, because that is what the brain development research tells us. The moment synaptic pruning kicks in, you're programmed to overreact to trauma stimuli. And in terms of sequelae are awful. It's very well demonstrated.
And that's pre-verbal, right? So many of us don't have access to those memories unless your mom tells you the stories, right? Like, one thing that I've had patients that say are going through a divorce are really worried about the impact on the kids. And I read a study a long time ago that looked at childhood trauma and children who had families who discussed the trauma with, who gave them a forum to say how they felt about it, what it meant to them. And they had a healthy adult that could help them undo the erroneous conclusion, right? That can help reduce the impact of the trauma. But most of us as children, we have these traumatic experiences and nobody talks to us about it. Even say the death of a parent or a grandparent. They don't want to talk. They don't want to bring it up. The kid looks okay, so let's not bring it up. And what I've learned through that study is that, no, bring it up. Say, how are you doing with a divorce? How are you doing that daddy and mommy are not together anymore? Or how are you doing that grandma died? And bring it up and don't be afraid of help them feel it, and to help them understand what it means. It doesn't mean that you're not worthy, or it doesn't mean that you are not important enough and that's why your dad left or your mom left her. So, the other piece for me that I really connect with what you're saying is that in our field, there's a lot of focus on crisis intervention or intervention, and there's very little discussion on health promotion and prevention. So in the field of health, those are the 3 things, right? So what else can we do in prevention and promoting health? And people think mental health issues, that's those people. And it's not. It is all of us. We all have a brain. We all have a mind. So to also provide for people some tools, simple tools, right? Now there's so much out there, YouTube apps where you do a guided visualization for 10 minutes every day, or you join a group to understand your experience.
I also seen examples, and I think we could do better along those lines, where like neighbors and friends recognize that the child's not doing well, and they come forward, deal with the child, help the child, pay attention to it. If we can encourage more people to have that sensitivity to pick up on it, so these kids have a chance to get away from that catastrophic environment. Some people do this spontaneously because that's their nature. I say, wonderful. Yeah. if you can make that happen.
Yes, for sure. I agree that, we should have more of community sense when it comes to children's well-being and not feel, oh, it's a boundary. No, get involved. You may make the difference.
For sure. If the family has a lot of internal problems, they do not want to have it rubbed in by a neighbor or by somebody. They're probably going to be defensive and protective. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't have a teacher who picks up on it. And there are many, good examples where they do. So how can we add all of this to our education and our practice habits? Yeah.
It's human experience, right? So when people think of psychologists, they think of, the expert that helps people. But we as people, all of us, you're not going to find somebody who's 30 who hasn't had something bad happen to them, right? Or who's 40 or 50. We're all in that human experience, right? And so to me, being human to others, like you and I are having this conversation right now. And I think with mental health, we need to speak about it. When I finished that PhD, which I finished with honors, Bonnie Long and Judith Danilov got me a gold medal for it. I got the CPA award for excellence, but I crashed emotionally. It was bizarre because it was such a high and so amazing. And then I had literally clinical depression, which I had never had. I'm not predisposed for it. And I speak about it because we need to say, right? And some of the things that have happened to my daughter with her health, traumatizing for me as well. So I think that the more of us who speak, the more that we eliminate that stigma against mental health and that conversation, I think that the more that politicians will be willing to fund services when they understand it, the more that people will seek help sooner than later. There won't be shame around it. And I think we would have a better world if we eliminated stigma. When I was at SFU, when I worked there, I developed a provincial stigma campaign called High Five. Start the conversation. Everybody has something to offer. And that was part of what we were wanting to do, is those of us who appear all together, appearances, right? But anyways, that we appear successful and so on. We need to talk about it, right? So not just people like my brother whose mental illness took such a chunk out of his life in a way, but all of us. And I think the more we speak.
I've seen a lot, actually. So, I could imagine that your program has contributed to it. I've done work with Canadian Mental Health Association. They're very much supportive of this kind of efforts. So I have to sense, and I'm somewhat optimistic that, people are more ready to accept it. They're more aware that we may have phases of depression and that we can recover from them, and that it's okay to talk about it.
It's not an us and them, eh? It's not somebody who's thriving today, their mental health, psychological health, can have a traumatic experience and be all the way in the throes of trauma and mental illness. And somebody with a mental illness today that's really struggling with the right supports can thrive. So it's not an us and them, all of us. And so I think if we start seeing it that way and not feel like you have to hide, you know what I say? That having a mental health problem is like a closet, like the LGBT community has a closet. It's a closet because nobody goes to work and says, oh, I have bipolar disorder openly. You may say I have diabetes openly, but you're not going to say that, right? So we need more of that. And, podcasts like this and conversations like these and stories like these and people willing to speak up can give people permission to seek help and to not feel shame and to understand their loved one better. Right? Because sometimes, like my dad thought my brother was just irresponsible and not consistent, and because he didn't understand.
True in a way,
his
but
son.
It doesn't explain it.
Right? And so my brother's self-esteem went to hell because he was not getting the understanding of his own internal torture, right?
So what do you think? Are we on the right way? Are we improving a few things? And
I think there's more and more.
It's slow progress. There's always on those topics, but
yeah, no, you see many celebrities now, right? Selena Gomez, for example, who has bipolar disorder and also lupus and a whole other, she's very outspoken. She has an organization for mental health. Glenn Close has a sister who has bipolar disorder. She also has an organization. Justin Bieber, our Canadian Justin Bieber, has spoken openly about his struggles with depression. And so I think the more that people out there, whether you're famous or not, you comfortably talk about it without shame and tells more stories, and there's more and more people that are opening up about it. The one tricky part is that now many people just want to figure out their diagnoses. So they're coming to us with, I think I have borderline. I think I have this. I think I have ADHD.
It's like medical school disease where you start off learning about disease and, I got all these symptoms. It's got to mean this, it's got to mean that. And
that's right.
I'm going to die soon.
So everybody now that is in, paying attention now, they're sure they have, I think I'm on the spectrum now. And that may just be part of the conversation, right?
Well, if we're going a little bit too far in the pendulum that way, let's hope it kind of goes back to something a little more normal.
I think it's important that we keep the conversation open. And those of us who have had experiences of trauma or depression like I have, that we just speak about it, right? Why would I be ashamed? And, and I can be resilient. I've gone to counseling so many times and to the psychologists and, to keep supporting myself to be well.
I should probably end it.
No, that's great. Thank you so much.
And I really appreciate how frank you are, willing to share. I hope people can derive benefit from that.
Thank you. Yeah. And the book is Improbable and Extraordinary, written by Saul Horwitz and Erika Horwitz. And I hope people find it as inspirational as we hope it is. So thank you so much for spending time with me.
Inside Your Mind, the BCPA Podcast.